What's so contrary about a contronym?
What makes an aptronym apt?
Which are the most distinctive demonyms?
Let's get retro with retronyms and proprietary with eponyms on this episode of Words Unravelled. Today on the show, we are going to name some nyms, aren't we, Rob?
That's right. Contronyms, demonyms, ethnonyms, eponyms. There's many a nym that can pass our lips. So,
Nym, 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 nym.
nym, 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 nyms. So where should we start, Jess?
Let's see. I'm feeling a little contrary, or as we've other people have pointed out when we've brought up this word before, as you would say, contrary. So I think we should start with one of my most frequently requested terms, and I believe this is frequently requested for you too, contronyms.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of people say, I've heard about these words that are their own opposites, and they're called contronyms. Why don't you make a video about that? And my reply has generally been, well, once you've pointed out that they're their own opposites, what more is there to say? So we're going to put that to the test now and see if there really is more to say, because I think there perhaps actually is.
Yeah, the more I thought about it and the more I dug in, the more I found that there is quite a lot to uncover here. These are also called antagonyms, and they're also called autoantonyms. They can also be called enantionymy, meaning the opposite name in Greek.
There's another name for them as well.
Oh, sure.
They're called Janus words. Have you heard this? Janus words? Janus words?
Like January, two-faced.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Fabulous.
Named after the Roman god who had two faces, as the first month of the year is, one face looking back at the year that's passed, one face looking forward at the year to come is sort of the theory behind that. And yeah, because these words are to some extent two-faced, because they are their own opposites, they also get called Janus words.
This is fabulous. I wonder if every nym has a corresponding Batman villain.
A Wario to the Mario.
In any case, they happen for a few reasons. Some contronyms are homonyms, which I'm sure we'll get into as well, that come from two different etymological sources but are spelled the same. Take the word cleave. It can mean to split or divide something, or it can mean to cling to something. And they're both from Old English, but they have two different roots. One of them means to adhere, and then one of them means to tear apart.
Yeah, these were very, very similar words, weren't they, in Old English? There were clorvan and clorvian.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So clorvan is to split.
The Proto-Indo-European root of the sticky cleave is related to words like clay, and then the Proto-Indo-European root of the rippy, splitty cleave, it shares a root with words like clever, which originally referred to like manual dexterity and distinction rather than intellectual dexterity, so to speak.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And so just through the sort of natural development of these words, they've developed into one another, and they've ended up being written the same way because they've been spoken the same way, and the same conclusions have been reached about how they should be written.
And some of them, though, are not from different sources. Like dust can mean to sprinkle dust onto something or brush dust off of something. And this happened because dust was a noun first, and then as a verb, it came to refer to the many things you can do with or to dust.
Yeah, I had a packet of pistachio nuts the other day, and it said on the packet, shelled pistachios. And I was thinking, that could either mean that they've got shells on them, or the shells have been taken off.
I'm assuming they had no shells.
These ones had no shells. Yeah, just if you see, I mean, luckily I could tell from the picture, so it was fine. I wasn't unpleasantly surprised.
Another one that comes up a lot is sanction, which can mean to legally grant permission or to prohibit something. And in both cases, it's just because the word sanction means to make valid or to bind by law, ultimately from a Latin word for like decreeing something.
Yeah, it's sancire, right, which is to render sacred. So it's the same origin as sanctify, and even saint. Actually, you could argue, it's not exactly the same, but they're all coming from the same place. There's a sort of holy link there, and so if you render something sacred, you put it into law, effectively, right? And what can a decree do? It can order someone to be punished, or it can permit them to do something.
Absolutely. And a couple of people brought up, I don't remember what the context was, but this was in the comments on one of our recent videos and or podcast episodes. It was the word fast, which can mean both swift and firmly attached, since in Old English, its primary meaning was something like vigorous or strong. So one could be running vigorously, like very committed to running, or stuck vigorously, like held fast onto something. And with regard to running in particular, it could also be from the notion of like sticking close to something that you're chasing.
Yeah, it's actually quite difficult to get from that original older meaning, which is the stuck fast idea, to the idea of it meaning something swift. Fast is a really, really solid Germanic word. I like that one. Have you heard of Anglish? This
Yes.
version, this sort of way that people like to speak by using as few borrowings as possible, by trying to avoid particularly romance borrowing. Well, one of the words of choice for a castle in Anglish is the old word fast, because it means secure, tight. There's something about the word fast that I like. It's sort of,
yeah, I agree. It does a lot of work, and it's very useful, and I always like it in the context of words like steadfast.
Yeah, exactly, and it comes up in a lot of old English compounds.
One more I like a lot is awful, which of course first describes something that fills you with awe or respect, so in a good way, and that lasted until the 1800s. It was mostly a good thing. Therefore, today we can have an awful time or an awfully good time.
These are a result of semantic bleaching, basically, aren't they? Where a word has been used so much that it's lost a lot of its power as a result, actually. But awesome is another one, right? And terrific as well. These words that once meant something profound in kind of the opposite direction to they do now.
Words that describe intensity tend to go back and forth in degrees of intensity and the implication of that intensity. And it's called amelioration when a word that's initially implies something bad goes good. And then it's called pejoration when a word that's initially good goes bad, like pejorative.
Yeah, so to ameliorate. It's the French to improve, améliorer. Also, peruse is quite an interesting example of something interesting semantically going on there. Sort of semantic broadening, I think they call it, where a meaning has... Well, actually, in the case of peruse, it's still got the original meaning, but it's also got this new meaning. So to peruse originally, I think it's fair to say, was to read in some detail, right? Was to sort of focus in on and read carefully. But now it can be a sort of cursory look.
Casually browsing.
Yeah. And we talked before about words being skunked, I think, when a word gets misused to the point of it no longer being useful. And I think peruse is probably there because that ambiguity is so undermining of whichever version you do not intend.
Right. Here's one that I've heard is regionally different, so we'll learn, I think, from each other here. When you are tabling an idea, what are you doing with it?
Oh, that's a really good point. So I would say you were putting forward an idea if you tabled it.
And when I say table it, I mean we're putting it aside for later, which I think is neat.
I didn't know that.
At least in the business environments in which I've worked, to table an idea is to like set it on a table over there so we can come back to it, or put it on the table so we aren't like currently discussing it.
It's a euphemism for kind of spiking the idea. That's interesting. So if I were in a business meeting, I might have thought it'd gone really well if I was talking to some Americans. I said, they loved my idea. They say they're going to table it.
Your table is far more important than our table. Our table is the graveyard of ideas.
Yeah, well, as we learned from our episode about food, the English table is a real mainstay of the English lifestyle.
One controversial contronym is irregardless, which many a pedant considers to be incorrect due to its redundancy. But it's been in use since the 1870s, and it's found in all major dictionaries as a synonym.
I'm sorry, 1870s isn't early enough for me to say, oh, well, that one's fine then. That's too recent.
I see.
It's its own opposite, but at the same time, I mean, it just shouldn't. It shouldn't be either.
My assumption is that it entered use as like a conflation of regardless and irrespective. We kind of smashed those two together to make irregardless mean more or less the same thing as irrespective.
Sure. Yeah. Another one, screen. To screen something, right? Can be to hide it, unless it's a film, in which case you're very much showing it off.
I like apology too, both an admission of error and a formal defense. Like Plato's
Yeah,
apology versus I apologize.
that's right. That's just a word whose meaning has largely changed, right? 'Cause that is when you see these literary apologies, that's what they are. They're a defense. They're not an admission of guilt and saying, sorry.
But when we call people apologists, that meaning still is in use. Like if you were an apologist for a particularly unpleasant political stance, then or unpleasant to your opponents, I suppose, then you're an apologist for something.
Yeah, you're defending that stance rather than saying sorry on that person's behalf.
Right.
So actually, there's been quite a lot to talk about on contronyms there.
Mm-hmm.
Have we got any more of them? Is there any more to say? Because I reckon people are going to have plenty of these to contribute to us in the comments on YouTube and to our email address.
I'd say one more, and this is another one that's particularly iconic. It's inflammable, which is interestingly older than the word flammable. It literally means to be inflamed or to be set alight. If you break down the word, like able to be flamed is a little more awkward because we don't typically use flamed to mean set alight, but we do use inflamed in that sense. So inflammable used to be the word for flammable. And then because it was confusing, presumably during the Industrial Revolution, when we were labeling things as flammable or inflammable, it was shortened to make it clearer.
Oh, and while we're taking an oversight on public safety, oversight is another one, right? If you have an oversight committee, they're paying a lot of attention to something. But if they commit an oversight, they have overlooked something. And actually, you could argue that overlook is another one, I think.
That's interesting. An oversight committee could make an oversight.
Both if they're doing their job well and if they're doing it badly, oversight is involved. So where do we go from contronyms?
Let's see.
I think actually there was more to say there than I was expecting.
Right. Another one that I think our listeners might really enjoy is demonyms.
Oh yeah, demonyms. Yeah. You know, I had got it into my head, and I don't know, I think someone must have told me this at some point, and I've since discovered it's untrue, but I'd got it in my head that word was invented for Wikipedia.
Huh, interesting.
Which is the main place that you see it, right? Because it is actually a really new name. And whenever you look at a Wikipedia entry for a place, it will have, you know, on that sort of sidebar with the bullet points of things, demonym will be on there. But actually, it is a pretty new word, right? I mean, it was coined in, I think, 1990, I think, by an author to mean what it means now. But it has had other meanings in the past.
And of course, it's just to make sure everybody's on the same page. It's a word for what you call yourself when you're from a place, a given place.
That's right. And that's what it has meant since the 1990s. But I found a citation from the 1890s that implied that same word meant a person who was named after a place. That was therefore a demonym. So this is from the Greek demos, right, meaning people, but it means sort of like the people of a place, right? It's the same root as democracy, for example. But even further back, it could also mean essentially a pseudonym, a pen name, a demonym.
Like a name for a person. Interesting.
Yeah, but let's get stuck into what it means now, because we
Yeah.
are a very current podcast. You got any favorites?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we might have to alternate here because the states have tons of them. Every single state has a ton of demonyms, and about half of them are funny or weird or interesting. For example, my husband he's currently working in Massachusetts, where everybody calls themselves massholes. They're also, if you live in Salem, Massachusetts, and somebody's from Massachusetts is going to have to tell me which pronunciation it is, but they call themselves, if you're from Salem, Massachusetts, a salamander or perhaps a salamander. I'm not sure how we say that.
I love that. You know, the fact that the United States are comparatively young means you can still come up with these things, whereas the ones in England are somewhat more set in stone.
Oh, I believe it.
We have a lot, for example, left over from Roman times, right? Or at least hark back to them. For example, Manchester, someone from Manchester is called a Mancunian, right? Which is Mancunium was the Roman name for Manchester. Someone from Cambridge is actually called a Cantabrigian because Cantabrigia was the Roman name. Because I've just explained this in a video I just did about city name origins in England, but now the river that runs through Cambridge is called the Cam, but it used to be called the Canter. Right. And then the theory is that the Normans somewhat struggled with Canterbridge pronunciation of it, and it kind of turned into Cambridge. And as a result, they felt they needed to change the name of the river.
That's incredible.
It's a good one, isn't it?
I love it.
And then there's also a Leodensian, which is a slightly lesser known one, but that's for someone from Leeds. And that comes from Leidensis, which was the Roman name for Leeds.
That's nice. The state ones are interesting. I feel like some of the interestingly, like, satisfying ones that still make a lot of sense to outsiders are like Michigander, Arkansawyer, Arky. You've got Mainers from Maine. But I also really like the like offbeat ones that you get, like in Michigan. You know, it's got the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula, and the ones from the Upper Peninsula are Yoopers. And I don't know how common this is, but I've also heard trolls for the Lower Peninsula because they're under the bridge, so to speak. And then in Wisconsin, of course, you've got cheeseheads. Are you familiar with this?
Of course, we've got cheeseheads. No, I'm not. What do you mean you've got cheeseheads?
Well, Wisconsin produces a lot of cheese. I believe like more cheese than either all other states or most other states. In fact, I have some Wisconsin cheese that I received as a gift from a Wisconsin-based friend the other day. It's fantastic. And then during Green Bay Packers football games in particular, you have a bunch of fans wearing cheese-shaped hats, which is in honor of the state rather than the name of the team, which is named after a meat packing company.
Okay, but now I'm satisfied that they're cheeseheads. If you're gonna call yourself cheeseheads, you've at least got to pop some cheese on your head.
And then in Illinois, Flatlanders, which if you've ever driven across Illinois, you know why they're called Flatlanders. It's very flat. Let's see, Rhode Island, we've got Swamp Yankees. That one might be an offensive one to people who actually live in Rhode Island, but it's listed as one of their demonyms on the official state page.
Swamp Yankees. You've got an opportunity, just let it go. Just let it go.
It's great. And then in Maine, you can either be a Mainer, but you can also be a maniac, which is perfect.
Yeah.
In Oklahoma, you could be an Okie or a Sooner, both of which have had negative connotations for parts of their lives. Sooners is a name given to settlers who entered the unassigned lands illegally in what is now the state of Oklahoma before the official start of the land rush. It's negative because while boomers were at the time the name of people who were part of the officially sanctioned, there's that word again, land rush and associated with like a pioneering spirit, Sooners were people who went too soon and were like apparently stealing land from the boomers. Granted, they were all settling on land from which Native Americans had been recently forced to move, so a little bit of a pot kettle situation there.
Is that the Sooner state then?
Yes, that is correct. And then Okies was made a little bit pejorative, like during the Dust Bowl situation, which of course you can read about in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath.
Wonderful. There's history involved in those. Which I like.
In Delaware, you might be a blue hen's chicken or a muskrat. The famous blue hen chickens were named for a Captain Caldwell from Kent County who carried with him a pair of fighting gamecocks, but the degree to which that is apocryphal, I am unsure. Muskrats also, because of the large number of muskrats present in the early days of the state, apparently. New York, you could be a Knickerbocker, which is a descendant of Dutch settlers referring to the pants, but also popularized thanks to Washington Irving, the author of Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, who had fictional and hoax-based stories about Diedrich Knickerbocker, a satirical character in a lot of his writings, which is a lot of fun.
We have some quite amusing sounding ones in Britain. For certain cities, rather than just having a demonym based on the name of that city, you have they're kind of nicknames. For example, I think people might be aware that Liverpudlians, so Liverpudlian is one name for
I
them,
love that one.
They also get called Scousers, right? which I think is okay. I don't think that annoys them.
We'll find out.
If it does. Yeah. Apologies if it does, but that's actually named after a soup that was popular with a stew that was popular with sailors.
It sounds a lot angrier than soup, the word scouser.
No, it's a meat and vegetable stew. The full name is lobscouse, or scouse. So they're called scousers because it was popular with them. And then actually the other side, the other coast, the northeast coast, you have the people of Newcastle who are known as Geordies, right? And that's traditionally a city well known for building boats, big naval presence there in the past, and also mining, pit mining. And so a popular name, first name among miners and sailors was George, right? And a sort of cute version of the name George in sort of Northern England and in Scotland is Geordie. So that's why Tynesiders get called Geordies to this
neat.
day. Yeah. People from Birmingham get called Brummies. And perhaps the best known one is the people of London, a very specific part of London, called Cockneys. You know about Cockneys?
A little bit. I mean, at least in terms of the, culture and rhyming slang and such.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, the rhyming slang. So to be a Cockney, you have to have, in theory, been born within the sound of Bow bells, so that the sound of the bells of Bow Church. And the term Cockney actually brings us back to chickens, where you've already taken us. It's thought to come from cockina eye, which means a cock's egg, right? Well, a cock can't lay an egg, can it? So a cock's egg is a term that's been used in the past to mean some dodgy offspring, right? Like a petulant child, for example, or maybe a runt or something like that.
Wow.
It was rather unkindly applied to city dwellers in the past. And then that term narrowed to dwellers of a very specific city and stays with us today in the name Cockney. And that's the leading theory, I should say, on that one. There are one or two other ones. For example, there's a French word that you'd use to describe like a cheeky child, which is a coquine. And it's possible that it's a variant on that, but most people think it's from a cock's egg.
That's funny. I live in Connecticut, where people sometimes call themselves nutmeggers, and it is unofficially known as the nutmeg state. The theory around this is that it comes from Yankee peddlers selling nutmegs in colonial times, but the nutmegs might have been like counterfeit wooden nutmegs because people would want the spice, but then it would just be like made of wood and they would sell them at the price of spices.
Cheeky.
That might be apocryphal too. There was a story where this is mentioned, called the sayings and doings of Samuel Slick of Slickville.
We talked about cities and localities. We could talk about country demonyms as well.
Oh, let's hear it.
Yeah, demonyms. Well, I just think it's interesting how countries with Germanic style names have Germanic style demonyms and Latinate names have Latin style demonyms, if you understand what I mean. So Iceland, right, which is a very Germanic name, someone from there is an Icelander, right? But yeah, the Latinate ones are things like, Mauritius, I suppose, would be a Mauritian, which is a Latinate. Because you have to think, do you just stick on the end, or do you stick Ian? And someone has to make this decision, but actually the decision is not as arbitrary as it sometimes seems. It's based upon the rules of the language that the name of the country is obeying.
I mean, we have a ton of hybrid words in English, but it still often sounds better to pair Latinate endings with Latin words and Germanic endings with Germanic words. It's just about
how it sounds. You don't know you're doing it when you do it. Yeah. And then a lot of the land ones are obviously, we just knock the land off if it's very obvious from the name of the country that it's the name of a tribe, like the Finns, for example.
Or the Angles, so to speak.
Or the Angles. Yeah, except we don't call people from England
not that
Angles
anymore.
or Engels, do we? So, actually, what is the demonym for someone from England?
Brit. That's all I got.
Yeah, well, that's it, and that's not fit for purpose, obviously, right? Because that would include the Scots and the Welsh and well, debatable who else as well. But there isn't one, right? Because we would say, we'd be tempted to say Englishman or Englishwoman, which obviously doesn't really, that's not going to fly for much longer, I wouldn't have thought. Same with French, but then you don't want to end up with a situation where it's like with the Swiss, where you're referring to one person from Switzerland as a Swiss, which just doesn't feel right. I have opinions on it.
I love this.
Spaniard's an interesting one.
I like that one.
Because that doesn't seem to comply with any of the rules, but that's just from the French, Old French, Espagnard.
It's pretty.
Yeah, it's nice that they get that one.
Let's see, any other demonyms before we move to another nym?
Well, can I just bring in another nym purely for the purpose of delineating it from the demonym, but you also have the ethnonym, which sounds like a very similar thing, right? And actually, probably in a lot of situations, you could more or less apply that word to both. But ethnonym, as the name suggests, actually refers to an ethnic group, and demonym refers to people of a geographical location. And occasionally these things do line up and occasionally they don't. Like a good example is a Kazakh, right? It's someone who probably does live in Kazakhstan, but not necessarily a Cossack, but someone from Kazakhstan is a Kazakhstani, right? And Croat as well is another one. You can be a Croatian, but the ethnonym would be Croat.
Oh, neat. Yeah. It all comes down to social dynamics within countries too, because some countries have more distinct cultural groups than others.
Yeah, it's actually quite a fraught question, really, in some parts of the world, particularly parts of the world where borders have been drawn that don't quite align with, the groups that have traditionally lived there. It's quite messy in the Balkans, I think, and I'm sure it's even messier in other parts of the world.
For sure. How about we move on to words that are named after people, now that we've talked about people named after places?
Oh, very good.
So we could do eponyms.
Eponyms, yes. And you will be our eponymous hero here, because I know this is something that you've done a lot of research into in the past. So tell us what an eponym is and give us a few.
So if an object or a place or a person or an institution or a music album or basically anything else is named after a person, it's an eponym. It can also be named after a proper noun, like a place name or something like that. Like Vanderbilt University is eponymously named after Cornelius Vanderbilt. If a musical artist releases an album that is named after them, then the album is eponymously named after them. Then there are also like words that you don't necessarily affiliate with the people that they were named after anymore, like sideburns, for example, which are named after U.S. Civil War General Ambrose E. Burnside, which sounds made up. It does sound made up, but I promise it is not. He famously sported this magnificent set of swooping whiskers that began at his temples and extended into a bushy mustache, absolutely resplendent, and so resplendent that the entire hairstyle was eventually named after him. But because it was less affiliated with him, it metathesized or anastraphized into sideburns.
We've talked a lot about folk etymology, and I think that would count as a folk etymology, although it's a kind of a non-standard way of doing it, is to switch the parts around rather than to substitute them for something that makes a little bit more sense.
Absolutely. In fact, Ambrose Bierce, another Ambrose, included sideburns on a blacklist of words to never use in his 1909 book, Write It Right, because he knew that it was derived from Ambrose Burnside's name. He said, it seems to be thought that the word side had something to do with it, and that as an adjective, that should come first. So it got rearranged, and he was very upset about the fact that it was no longer affiliated with the man himself.
I've got an eponym to contribute.
Okay.
But it's a bit of an unusual one insofar as it's a word that comes from a person who never existed.
Ooh, we love these.
Yeah, so readers of my newsletter will already know this one. Apologies, I'm repeating myself so far as you're concerned. But there is a word that was gained some sort of political currency in the 1800s, right? Which was rawback. Right, I don't know if you've ever heard of this word, but it's a word that we kind of need now because it means a deliberate lie spread for political gain, right? And it all goes back to the 1844 election in the United States and a lie that was spread about James K. Is it Polk? Is it pronounced Polk or Poke?
That's
Polk?
right.
Polk?
Well, I've always said it Polk.
Well, he ended up being the 11th president, right? But a rather nasty rumor was spread about him, saying that, you know, he had slaves, which was true, but that he had branded them with
Oof.
his initials, right?
Ooh.
And this, I think the history has decided was untrue, but this rumor was supposedly spread by someone called Baron von Rohrback.
Oh, no kidding. That's really interesting.
But Baron von Rohrback did not exist.
That does sound like a made-up name.
Yeah, Baron von Rohrback is the made-up source of this rumor, because they needed to say, well, where did this come from? They say, oh, it came from Baron von Rohrback. So in years after that, directly following it, this term Rohrback became a byword for a political lie. There's a quote from the Boston Journal saying the Herald and Globe, so having a dig at its competitors, saying the Herald and Globe abound in Rohrbacks, which are designed to influence the vote in Maine.
There was a lot of, like, especially in like the 1800s, and I think this happened all over, but there was a lot of like personification of different types of characters, and that's how we got like Uncle Sam and things like that. These fictional characters who became emblematic of groups of people. I don't know if there's like a character affiliated with them, but like a lot of political cartoons illustrate like carpetbaggers during the post-Civil War era. So it's so interesting to see these characters come to life. And they also appeared during the World Wars, right? Like there was sort of a nickname of sorts for people from different countries who were participating in the war, right?
Yeah, quisling is one of them. It's a term for a sort of traitor, because there was this guy called Vidkun Quisling, who was a Norwegian who basically helped the Germans to invade Norway. So his name became synonymous with another nym, with treachery. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And we had, as far as synonymy with treachery, we had Benedict Arnold for a while.
Right. Yeah. And also a word that we use quite often, it's kind of the opposite of treachery, but we talk about chauvinists, right? And Chauvin,
who is also possibly fictional.
I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah, apparently he was supposedly like emblematic of Napoleonic zeal.
Yeah, that's right.
After the wars. So whether he was a real person is not known. He may have been, but it also was like Nicolas Chauvin was apparently a relatively common name among that group. So he may have been a character.
Yeah, so it means that chauvinism relates to a fanatical loyalty to a specific cause. In the case of Chauvin, whether he existed or not, it was Napoleon. But that is why sometimes people would just say chauvinist when they mean male chauvinist, for example, right? The word has kind of changed meaning. You do sort of have to specify what someone's being chauvinistic about.
Originally, it was like nationalistic zeal, and now, thanks to the 1960s feminist movement, it became more affiliated with male chauvinism.
Right, and then the male has been sort of shed in a lot of contexts, and now it's been basically the same as misogyny.
Yeah. I don't know how many of these we have in common necessarily. Proprietary eponyms, which are genericized trademarks, so brand names that have come to replace the things that we refer to today. Like Kleenex is used instead of tissues in many cases over here, or Band-Aid instead of adhesive bandage. And you call them plasters, right?
Yeah, we call them plasters. Yeah, we do. We don't call them
Why do you call them plasters? Do you know?
I don't know why we call them plaster, because obviously you have a plaster cast, right?
Yeah.
Which is something much more substantial. I don't know. I think they're sticking plasters, and maybe it's just that, that they're being described as like that thing that you wrap around, when you're sorting yourself out.
Yeah, maybe it's like a mini cast.
Yeah, it's another one of those that someone could probably explain like that, but I don't actually happen to know. But one of the big proprietary ones in Britain is Hoover, right? Because we don't talk about doing the vacuuming, we talk about doing the hoovering a lot of the time.
I like that one. Though I think over here, if you said Hoover, it'd be more affiliated probably with the president, right?
Yeah, or J. Edgar Hoover, right? Yeah. Doing the hoovering is bugging someone's apartment.
That guy. A couple that always, like, I think are kind of interesting that we use a lot are like ping pong. Originally, it in fact is currently still owned by Parker Brothers. Originally, it was table tennis.
Or whiff waff as well. Whiff waff is a good old name for table tennis.
Fun.
Table tennis.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, whiff waff. Yeah, I think it's onomatopoeic, guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. Breathalyzer, jacuzzi, rollerblade, super glue, windbreaker, zipper, and even TV dinner are also originally genericizations of
Zipper
trademarks.
is one.
Yep.
As in what I would call my fly.
Uh-huh.
The top zip on my trousers.
Yeah. I mean, it's the most appropriate name for that particular technology. So
calling that makes a lot of sense. I don't know. Fly seems a bit of an odd choice from our end, but sticking with it.
Are you also aware? So, I mean, I guess this one is still often treated as the acronym that it used to be, but we kind of use it in a genericized way, and it has a wild history. But taser, like a stun gun.
Yeah, I don't know
know
what it stands for. I know that it is an acronym. I couldn't like laser is.
You will never ever guess it. It is loosely inspired by laser, and well, largely inspired by laser, but you will never guess what it stands for. It doesn't stand for anything that laser stands for. It stands for Tom A. Swift's electric rifle. Do you know who Tom A. Swift is?
I have no idea. But I fear his electric rifle.
You should. You absolutely should. It's terrible. So Tom A. Swift was a character in a series of books developed by Edward L. Stratemeyer's company, the Stratemeyer Syndicate. He was the big guy who started publishing books like The Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Bobbsey Twins, sometimes written by ghostwriters, sometimes written by himself. He apparently wrote like 1,300 of them, but they're these like recurring characters written by usually attributed to a single person, but often written by a variety of people. But Tom Swift was one of them, and his whole shtick was that he was a teenage genius who would go on adventures, and his inventions would save the day. And apparently the guy who created the taser was a big fan of Tom Swift books, so he named it after one of the inventions, the electric rifle. Unfortunately, the book in which the electric rifle appears, the book is called Tom Swift and His Electric Rifle, it's also called Daring Adventures in Elephant Land, and it involves killing a lot of elephants and also native people. It's real bad. Reading that
so
book
annoying when the facts get in the way of
right.
a good fun story. And
like the language used to describe the native people is real bad. It's in the public domain, so you can go check it out yourself. But I was gasping by the time I finished that book, because definitely not terms that we use for people from Africa today.
Yeah. Not very nice ethnonyms, I can imagine.
But the fact that taser makes perfect sense because of its connection to laser, and like that, it's not problematic to use that because it's so wildly divorced from the technology the way we use it today. But the history there, the deeper you go, the weirder it gets.
So now that you've so artfully managed to combine both an eponym and an acronym in one there, very impressed. Can I try and test you on some onyms?
Yes, let's do it.
Because I've got a big pile of them here. We're not going to be able to get to go in depth into all of them this time round, but we have the rest of our lives to get round to doing the other ones, because that's how long this podcast is going to go on for. Yeah, I've got a whole list here, and I reckon you might be able to guess what some of them mean if you don't already know, because you perhaps know some of these already. But if not, I'm going to enlighten you as to what some of these onyms are. By the way, I thought they were all nyms, but they're not. They're onyms because they're from the full Greek.
Onomatos.
Yeah, exactly. Which is the same as at the start of onomatopoeia.
Exactly.
Which means named in this way, which actually is quite a disappointing meaning for onomatopoeia.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't like that. Anyway.
In the book, The Liar's Dictionary, onomatopoeia is described as the sound of you attempting to spell onomatopoeia on a keyboard, which I love.
Yeah, that's superb. That's much better than the actual explanation, which is actually quite dull. Okay, here we go. Onym test.
All right.
Do you know what an allonym is?
I used to know this one, but I don't recall off the top of my head.
Yeah, so this is a type of pseudonym. It is a name taken on by the author of a work to give the impression that it was written by someone else who hasn't necessarily given their permission. So they've used someone else's name and a real person's name. So it's not quite like a pseudonym where you might pick a fake name. That's called an allonym.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Do you have an example? I guess if if like you went by Shakespeare or something, I don't know.
Or you just wrote a really garbage play and said by William Shakespeare. That would be an
Okay,
allonym.
Fair.
It's fraud, basically. It's a form of
Oh,
fraud.
okay, so it's much worse than just like nodding to someone.
I mean, I guess it would still count as an allonym if you were doing it in an adoring way, some sort of fan fiction or whatever. But no, I think it's not a good it's not a good approach. The allonym. You want to go for just a nice normal pseudonym. Pluck a couple of names out of the air and hope that they don't match with an existing author. How about a characternym?
I mean, that sounds like the name of a character.
It does sound like that. And it is to some extent, but it's a name based on someone's character or the character of
I
person.
see, like moral character.
Or yeah, or think of the 7 dwarves, right, who are named after characteristics. Actually, characteristics is a better word than character in this case.
So like allegorical characters.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a character in Chaucer called Placebo. Placebo means I am to please, right? And then placebo is a sycophant.
Very nice.
What about an aptronym?
I know this one. I like this one a lot. This is a name that is apt for the person who has it and also is often affiliated with nominative determinism.
Yeah. Whenever I've heard conversations about nominative determinism, the nominative determinism phrase is very sort of conspicuous and it feels kind of clunky. But now I know that there is a word for that type of name rather than having to say, that's nominative determinism every time.
Right, it's a mouthful, but aptronym is a little tighter.
You know any good aptronyms?
Let's see. So, of course, we've got Usain Bolt, who is one of the fastest people in the world. The fastest person in the world? Is that right? Is he still
definitely was. I don't know if anyone's called him up yet.
Obviously, William Wordsworth, classic. Psychiatrist Jules Angst. Rosalind Brewer was an executive at Starbucks and also worked for Molson Coors Brewing Company. And then one of my favorites of all time, the former president and CEO of the nonprofit Food for the Poor was named Robin Mahfood.
That is beautiful. That is
so
beautiful.
Good.
The weather lady on the television where I grew up was called Sarah Blizzard.
Oh, that's darling.
Very good. I've since met her. She's very nice.
That's great. And then, of course, you see them in fiction all the time. Like Dickens is full of aptronyms. The Mahfood, by the way, the mention on that one, I was incorrect. That is an inaptronym. That is a word where your name implies the opposite of what the person is or does because they are not taking your food. They are providing food for the poor.
Well, there's kind of another word for that as well, which is a caconym. Which,
ooh,
yeah, you can
like
think of
cacophony?
Like cacophony. So cacophony is a bad sound, right? So yeah, an inappropriate name would be a caconym. And just like a cacophony is a bad sound, a euphonium is a beautiful sounding instrument. And you can also have a euonym, which is a very nice name, a name that's well suited to someone.
That's delightful.
Yeah, it's quite similar to an aptonym, really. But I don't know, say like a really pretty lady called Rose or something like that. That's quite a cheesy example, but you know what I'm getting at.
And we've addressed Thomas Crapper, who, contrary to popular rumor, didn't specifically invent the toilet, but did work in sanitation and therefore had an aptronym.
There you go. There you go. I'm really impressed with how many aptronyms you managed to just come up with there, by the way. I genuinely did not prime Jess for that one. Okay, I'm going to throw one more at you. Tautonym.
Would that be like a tautology? So it's repetitive. It's a name that's repetitive, or has a like the Librea tar pits, which means the tar pits or something like that.
Oh, that's very good. Now, yes, that's excellent. I like that. So that is not where this is normally used, but yeah, okay, you know, right. Like there's this place Torpenhow, right, in England, where it means hill. You are right. It is a repetitive name, but actually, tautonym is more specifically used in taxonomy, right? Particularly in zoology, where you have the generic name and the specific name being the same thing, like ratus for a rat, or chinchilla is one that I've only just discovered.
Homo sapiens sapiens.
There you go. Gorilla. as well. So these are tautonyms.
That's very cool.
Yeah, and actually, it's not allowed in botany to have a tautonym. They are ruled out. So you get them in zoology, but you do not get plants that have got two names that are the same, that are repetitive.
The chaos of scientific naming conventions is always really entertaining because it's obviously like an attempt to standardize that has wildly failed.
It is a disaster, isn't it? Oh, this will make everything so much clearer. No.
Nope.
No, it hasn't. Oh, well, I'm actually quite impressed with the way you managed to deduce a lot of these onyms. But there are many of them. And we haven't even gone into the basics of like synonyms and antonyms.
Oh, yeah. So shall we close out this podcast with retronyms?
Yes, let's look back on a podcast well recorded with retronyms, because retro means backwards, right? And a retrospective is to look back. So what is a retronym then?
So a retronym is when like an advancement of some kind requires us to clarify older versions of things by adding distinguishing words to the original term. This one was it was coined by NPR president Frank Mankiewicz. So for example, we say cloth diaper now, but all diapers were cloth until disposable ones were invented. And satellite used to refer to any naturally occurring object in orbit before the launch of Sputnik. So now naturally occurring orbiting objects are called natural satellites.
Yeah, or an acoustic guitar used to just be a guitar, but now it's an acoustic guitar, to contrast with an electric guitar. And a landline telephone as well. It doesn't have to take very long. It's only a few decades, I suppose, between the landline telephone just being the only telephone, and all of a sudden the mobile telephone, as we call it over in the UK, comes along and means you've got to rename the old one.
Now we have to clarify what kind of book we're reading. It's not just a book; it's a print book, or it's an e-book, or it's an audio book.
Oh, that's depressing. I don't think I've ever had to say, I'm going to assume people assume I'm reading a physical book until I tell them it's an ebook.
A couple of more retronyms. We've got manual typewriters. We've got snail mail. We've got plain text. This happens with like video games and devices. After the release of the PS2, the first PlayStation was re-released as the PS1.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like, and World War I would be another example of that. Right, what was the Great War? Has to retrospectively be named the First World War. Yeah.
And if you name a child after yourself with the exact same name, suddenly you are retronymically called senior or the first.
Good point. Any more for any more?
I think that will about do it for this edition of NIMS, though I'm sure there are many more NIMS that we can unlock in the future.
This has been a good one for the word nerds, I think.
Absolutely.
And I'm shoehorning the phrase word nerd in because I want to show you something, Jess. I've got a t-shirt on.
Oh, I love it. I love that so much. That's
like
cute.
it?
I'm gonna have to get a matching one.
You are from my shop because I designed it.
Excellent.
Yeah, I've just put together a few wordy, nerdy designs for things, and I took receipt of them today. I'm rather excited about them. I've got this little mug. Look. Can you read what it says?
Linguists love
pie, because it's Proto-Indo-European. You see,
the asterisk. That's so cute.
Like PIE. I'll show you what else. All right, this is so shameless. I made one about IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet / my favorite type of beer.
Perfect.
One for the adults, which is Hardcore Thorn.
Oh, I want that one.
Well, yeah. Anyway, so I'm gonna put those up on the internet. By the time this goes out, they will be available. If you go to robwords.com/shop, you'll be able to find either the UK shop, which works for Europe, or the US. Thank you for letting me plug my stuff.
Oh, you let me plug my stuff all the time. This is great. I look forward to wearing the Thorn shirt on our next episode.
Brilliant. Do it. Thanks a lot for watching or listening to this episode of Words Unravelled. It's been a pleasure.
Share your favorite NIMS in the comments or reach out to us at wordsunravelledpod@gmail.com.